Well, good morning and welcome to the Economist Board for September 2023. I'm John Nelson of M&A. I'm joined by Keith Prather of Armada. How you doing today, Keith?
I'm doing fantastic. Doing great. How are you?
Great. Yeah, ready to get on with it. With in this video and the subsector videos, we're going to dive into what's driving each of our forecasting models. Some interesting times ahead, particularly as we look at some particular sectors that seem to be contradicting one another. But we're going to dig into what's underneath that and try to explain why. And just kind of as a reminder, we've got all kinds of different economic factors that are competing with one another, fighting with one another, trying to drive these models one direction or another. And hopefully, as we peel the onion back, you'll have a better understanding of what's going on and why and how it affects your business. So with that short introduction, let's go ahead and get on with it. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up our industrial production for manufacturing, good old IP man. And well, Keith, it's kind of the same story, kind of not. Last time's IP man kind of had this little bit of a scoop. In general, though, you can see we had a rise, but it's a little bit more encouraging before. Scale's a little bit different, not much, but generally, it's a fairly positive outlook. However, when you look from now to the very end of the forecast, both were saying about flat, and we're kind of there again now.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. This is this is a very broad measure of manufacturing, so this includes both durable and non-durable goods. And when we look at other data, what we're seeing is that the durable sector is still doing very well. So when we think about things like defense manufacturing, automotive, aerospace, some machinery, there are pockets, even the computer and electronic side, there are pockets of the economy, especially the manufacturing side of the economy and the durable side, that are doing very well. The non-durable side, though, is slowing down a little bit. And I think that's why the model's kind of fighting through some of this push and pull. It does show that over the next few months, this is going to be a little bit of a lift in activity and output. Some of that is just because the supply chain has gotten so much more efficient. It's recovered from the last 2 years when we had supply chain challenges. And so with all those bottlenecks and backlogs cleared, manufacturers are able to keep output fairly much in line with order demand. So backlogs are way down, and so we get these little spurts like this where you do see a little bit of an influx of orders, and then off we go. Now we'll say there is one major headwind, John, in the macro economy that is still kind of fighting against us, and that's the role of inventories. And the model does look at inventory levels, and it does look at those levels relative to sales. But when we look at just inventory to sales ratios by themselves and we compare them to the way they were in the decade prior to the pandemic, one of the things we find out is that about 65% of the product manufacturing, product moving, and product marketing or product selling side of the economy is overstocked right now relative to where it was prior to that pandemic. And so I know we've been telling this narrative now for several months. It continues, and it has still kept a lot of the upper part of the supply chain shut off. And I think when we look at a couple of the next models, when we look at the differences between fabricated metals and primary metals, you can kind of see that difference. And so that's kind of where we are with IP Man. And again, just as a general barometer for general manufacturing, it's still showing some pretty decent strength, and we do see that in other data.
And if we look long term, you can still see we're pretty much on trend, if you will. A little bit of a bump the next 6 months above it. So I kind of, if anything, I kind of expect that to flatten out a little bit if the way the models have been reacting in the past is any indication of future performance. So I think that'll flatten out a little bbit, but remaining on trend is something I'd expect, at least from as I'm seeing the indices rolling in.
Yeah, and some of the other things too, like like construction, for instance. Construction is actually doing very well, non-residential construction and multifamily construction. And so the manufacturing sector that supports that industry, that really keeps it thriving and keeps it supplied, is seeing really good, strong order demand right now. Now, looking forward, kind of what the model is picking up is that that industry, along with others, are going to face some financial challenges as we get into 2024, with interest rates rising, some regulatory pressure on banks, and what we think is probably some continued pressure on companies being able to get financing. And so specifically, we're starting to see a drop in brand new applications for commercial lending and industrial lending. And we're starting to see banks tighten credit standards across a lot of different sectors of the lending environment. So again, commercial, industrial, even some consumer loans. That pressure builds and it creates a headwind later in the cycle. And later in the cycle right now, the models are kind of telling us sort of look like the second half of 2024. And that coincides, John, with what I was told. I went to a developer conference. I know I've talked about that in prior months. And at that developer conference, they were kind of saying, 2023 feels pretty good from a developer perspective, even the early part of 2024, as we have projects that have already been funded, financing's in place, they're shovel ready, just got to get the supply chain in order and those projects will take off. But then they were concerned about the back half of 24 and early 25, when some of this financial pressure builds on the construction sector and it's tough for them to get projects started.
Sure.
There's some ratios out there right now, and it shows about a year ago that project delays, so projects that were ready to go, designs in place, plans in place, everyone's hired, but the project can't get started. A year ago, about 70% of the rationale for why that was could be tied back to either labor shortages or supply chain shortages. Only 10% of that was tied to financial challenges and getting financing for a project. Now it's completely inverted. As of last month, it's about 70% of the projects getting delayed are because of financing issues. About 10% each are due to labor and supply chain shortages. So the moral of that story is it's much harder to flip the pendulum and change the cycle for financing issues than it is in trying to get the supply chain fixed and trying to find labor. So I think the model is, showing us exactly what we need to be prepared for. So
Gotcha. Well, let's go take a look then a little bit further into the supply chain. And do you want to look at fabricated or primary first?
Your call, man. Let's go fabricated. How about that?
Okay, let's go fabricated then. We're going to take a look at fabricated metals. And if you're a fabricated metal producer, it's a good news story. It's getting better.
Yeah.
What I will tell you is that you can see that it's been improving. Before it was mostly flat, although with a general rise now with more of an increase in that rise.
Yeah, and I think we both agreed off camera. We were talking about this, and I think the back half of this is going to cool once we start to see some of this monthly, change in demand, if you will. And so, but for fabricated metals, there's so many sectors that are still hot. When you look at the automotive, you look at the aerospace models we have, you look at some of the machinery sector, some of those big heavy drivers of fabricated metal demand. Those are doing pretty well. And I will tell you this too, John, that the fabricated metal industry right now is probably pretty balanced when it comes to inventories. So when they get new orders, they are having to activate their entire supply chain to get raw materials in, to get the labor in place. They're using energy and they're producing goods. They're not sitting on a ton of inventory. So that's a little bit different than maybe what we'll see in a minute from primary metals, where there's a lot of built up inventory. So when fab metal gets a brand new order, they're going full output, and that's what the model's reflecting here. Their need to create output.
And what, from what I'm seeing with models, and as we're taking a look at some of the things in Skunk Works, where I'm expecting this model to kind of take a turn next month. You said you would expect it to cool down. The indications, that this model is going to settle like next month, probably right between where it is now and where it was last month. So that's kind of where I'm expecting this one to still be positive, but it'll be about halfway between.
Kind of flattening out a little bit.
And flattening out in a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
So long term, obviously we're well above trend. What's nice about this is that the trend has been for 20 years going down. If we maintain somewhat of this positive outlook, like even if we're only splitting the difference, we're talking about a period of time where we're going to start reversing a 20-year trend of going, or not reversing it entirely where it was going down, but starting to flatten out that 20-year trend, more towards that 10-year trend where it's going to, let me pull up my little marker, where instead of just taking a just dive this way, that 10-year trend is going to look something like this.
Yeah.
Somewhere around that 104, 105 range straight across. And so I think that's really good for the industry.
And the last thing I'll say, one of our partners, Chris Keel, always talks about the fact that fabricated metals is really driven by other industries. And, so seeing this uptick, and especially as we see more manufacturing being reshored back in the US, you would expect demand to go up. Yeah. So the model's probably showing us a little bit of that reshoring trend, as well as some of those sectors that it does feed off of, still staying pretty stable right now.
Okay. Well, let's jump to primary metal, precursor to that, and see how that's driving things. And, here, all right, your turn. Try to explain this one, pal.
Well,
we do have that general drop off. It looks a little bit more encouraging, at least for the next 12 months of what it was doing before. But it's still fairly flat until a drop off at the end, which, again, you're so far out on these drop offs. When you're out that beyond 12 months, the forecast starts getting a little jinky, if you will.
It does. I mean, I think you and I both feel pretty confident when we get, 6 months out. We know we're confident because we can see that data. When we get 9 to 12 months out, we're still feeling pretty confident. You get beyond about a year, and it really starts to, as you said, get jinky. So, I think part of this is a role of, again, a lot of the primary metal manufacturers sitting on a lot of inventory right now, and maybe concerns building in, especially the construction sector, a little bit of maybe an overbuilt situation coming in automotive eventually. We do know that spending on automotive and car sales are starting to slow down a little bit. Prices have gone up so much for new and used cars that consumers that wanted to buy probably have probably made those purchases. And now you kind of got the rest of the marketplace that really either can't afford to buy or just unwilling to pay kind of some of those prices right now, starting to bail out of the market. And so anyway, it's picking up a little bit of that pressure, I think, on the tail end. But yeah, for now, this is a scenario that we're seeing kind of around the world, where demand for primary metals is falling all over the place. And so it's not surprising.
Yeah. And, long term, it looks like an awful chart, because when you condense that period, it looks like we're falling off the cliff and never coming back. But again, that 12-month look, though, is actually really fairly positive, especially compared to the 20-year trend, or even the 10-year trend.
Yeah, this is one of those times where I think you and I both would counsel most of our members or subscribers to really kind of disregard a little bit of that far tail end. There's a couple data points in there in that model that I think are really making it go negative. But you're right. If you look at that trend out to July of next year, it's showing some pretty solid demand, stable and better than maybe than it's been over the last, 2 to 3 years. So the fact that it would just fall off a cliff when we see other models doing other things, makes us a little suspect on it, just a little. We'll see.
Sure.
But we've also, the other thing is, and I always say this, we've also come to kind of trust in the data and trust in what the models are showing us. So makes it hard at the same time to kind of ignore that it's picking up that much pressure on the tail end. So can't ignore it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that concludes our look at industrial production, as well as, the precursor supply chain, both primary and fabricated metals. We hope you've enjoyed this, and join us again next month.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.